You are listening to the Mark Guzman Podcast Experience. In real estate, almost every sale and refinance requires an appraisal by a licensed appraiser. But there are many other times when an appraisal is needed outside of a sale or refinance. My guest today is Keli Renner. She's been doing appraisals since 1987, and she's here today to explain why appraisals are needed and how she goes about appraising a property's value. This is a very educational episode for property owners and realtors. Enjoy. So welcome to another episode of Real Realtors. My guest today, Keli Renner. So thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I'm excited for this episode because this is the first time we have an appraiser on the podcast. And this series of Real Realtors, I talk with real estate professionals and we talk everything about real estate. And we've covered so many different topics, but I really want to get into how do you appraise a property? How do you determine the value? What are the different things you look for in a property? What are the different deductions you give to it? How do you adjust a property? So let's get started and right into it. When did you get into appraising properties?
I originally started in the industry in 1987, and at that time there was no licensing of the state required until 1992, and I was working for a bank, and at that point I got licensed through the state as a licensee, licensed versus certified, and then later on upgraded the license to certified level, which indicates you can do anything over $1 million in appraisals loan amount. So if you're qualified, you could do something for $5 million kind of thing. And then subsequent to that, if you're an appraiser for more than, I believe it's 3 years, sort of like a lawyer, you're entitled to get a broker license or a realtor's license without the sales experience.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So I decided after several years back in 2007 to get just the regular real estate level license.
Can you just apply for it and you just get it, or are there different class requirements you still have to take?
There are still varying class requirements that you have to take to be a realtor, and a broker is exponentially larger than that. So I got the realtor license, and then I called Allied Business Schools in San Diego, which is a great school to learn from. And they said, well, you only have like 2 or 3 more classes to get the broker license. So I thought, well, why not, right? Since I'm on a roll and I've already studied for that. So a couple of years later, I went and got the broker's license back in 2009. So I've had that, and I'm a broker associate with Keller Williams as well, but appraising is more of my craft than selling real estate.
So why do you like real estate so much?
I feel that it's in my blood now. I've gone through a lot of cycles, and I've been through a lot of the ups and downs. I got laid off after 17 years with Great Western Bank as an in-house appraiser there, and I went for a year of schooling to do something else like administrative secretary, learned all the Microsoft suite, etc. And then after I did that, appraising came back again because the market does have its highs and lows. And that's kind of kept me in the loop. And then now, I'd say about 2/3 of the appraisers have fled from the industry in the last 5-6 years because of all the new laws that have come into place. There used to be, I think, around 45,000 appraisers. Now there's 15 plus or minus. So the 2/3 of the appraisers through the ups and downs have left the industry, and they passed even newer laws that in order to become certified, you need a 4-year degree. Unlike if you're a realtor, you do not need a degree. If you want to be just at the license level for appraisals under $1 million loan amount, you need a 2-year degree. So it's become very hard to get into the industry, and it's made it so that appraisers, I feel, are aging out. And part of that could be that they plan on doing more tech-related artificial data with this type of thing, but you still, pre-existing homes, I feel, still need the interior inspection and someone live to tell you what's going on there if the house has deferred maintenance. Newer homes, I think, are more accepted because they have a lower effective age, less problems, less maintenance. And then, of course, non-tract homes would be harder to pinpoint values because they're all different. But with the advent of drones, I could see that lenders may get into drones being like maybe knocking on your door someday, surveying the outer part of the house, making sure that, you know, the landscaping's upkept, there's no debris that needs to be removed. That could be interesting if it gets to that, but you never know, right?
Yeah. So I want to get your opinion on recently Freddie Mac announced that they are going to start only with a small percentage of loans doing automated appraisals as opposed to having an appraiser go out to the property. I want to get your opinion on that. Is that good or bad for the industry? What are the pros and cons?
Part of that, I think, plays into their risk. So if they see that there's an exceptional amount of equity in the home and they don't have that much risk, then that's when the artificial intelligence might cut down costs, and then you're not wasting the consumer's money, and it's a little fair to both sides in that regard. So again, it could eliminate some of my work, but that's why you want to be diversified in the type of appraisals that you might do, like date of death, divorce settlements, FHA, VA, and sort of spread yourself out so that if the market does change and dry up, that you have other alternatives than just being pigeonholed with one client, one lender.
Okay, so you bring up a very good point on the reasons why you get an appraisal. So many people don't understand that when someone passes away, you should get the property appraised. Normally that comes into play with tax basis. I mean, what are the other reasons why someone should have a property appraised?
The retrospective one, which you mentioned, which most attorneys will recommend their clients to get, or accountants to get those tax bases established. Some people might, in a divorce settlement, want to know how much they have to pay the other person out and or how much it's going to be to put on the market for sale. In some cases, it's for equity loans or for refinances and so on.
Okay. So walk us through the process of how you appraise a property. What are you looking for?
There's several elements that go into appraising a property. The main elements you establish first are the property characteristics, to include location, to make sure that it's not located near a freeway, school, power lines, this type of thing, because you'd want to match that location. View amenities, golf course placement with views or non-views within a community will make a difference on the lot premium and that type of amenity. There's also the age factor. There's sometimes newer home developments that are nearby and older established neighborhoods, so you want to stay within your neighborhood boundaries. And schools can make a huge difference in what the property offers. And I've had it with my experience where one street in Walnut Creek was pretty long, but it was part was unincorporated, part was Lafayette, part was Walnut Creek. So literally it had 3 different school districts going on. And so unless you were researching that, and it's not my job to quote, other than like it's Mount Diablo, so it houses all these different schools, it's better that the person wanting to know about schools research that themselves, because if you quoted that they're in the school district, and let's say even on purchasing a home, that's maybe why they purchased the home, you don't want to be held liable if they're busing that child to another school outside of the district because things have changed or it wasn't in what was surface where you pretty much verified that.
Yeah, material fact.
Where, for instance, Lafayette, part of it is unincorporated on Relays Valley Road, and those houses can be anywhere from 100 to 200,000 difference because their tax bases are different and they don't have the Acalanes, Union School District. They have the Mount Diablo. So
Okay.
even the city you're living in could be the same, but not the same district.
Okay. So once you've identified the characteristics of the property, what's the next step?
The next step is going out in the field and doing a thorough inspection, and that would include identifying the comps that you think would be most reasonable and applicable to it based on the square footage, the lot size, the lot utility, surveying the home to get the overall photographs taken, and that is kind of provides proof obviously to the lender that requires you to have like main areas and baths and bedrooms identified. And at that point you want less historical sales versus something that's dated, so it shows that this is the most recent. And you can look at pendings and listings and call on those if you don't have the available inventory that's closed to see if they're closing soon, so you can kind of wrap that in. Some realtors will be more forthcoming with the information, while others are reluctant because of their client not letting them tell you if it's within 5% or 3% or over or under the list price type thing. Then there's a comprehensive report that details out a lot of information that you have to identify, like the site. There's 3 elements in your report that contribute to your analysis, which would be the sales comparison analysis, the cost approach, and the income approach. Now, typically with just a single family home constructed on a site, your most relevant approach will be the sales comparison approach, which are the comps that after you grid them out based on, again, the lot utility, the condition, the age, the square footage, and that all being equal and making the adjustments will kind of give you an idea or a weighted range. Even though you're not weighting the comps per se or averaging them, you're determining which ones are most relevant based on maybe being less historical, having less adjustments, and then putting a number on that, an estimation of value.
Okay. Now, in your experience, have you found values to be more accurate on the sales comparison approach as opposed to the square footage approach?
Yes, because the square footage approach is often used for the income approach as far as the cost to build, etc., because the sales comparison approach is actually what's most relevant. The income approach can be, again, more about the cost per square foot, this, that, and the other. What we call in appraisal terms is the GLA, gross living area. That is gridded out. You want to stay within a certain, you don't want something to be an over or an under improvement. So if, let's say, you're in an area that's typically a 3-bedroom, 1-bath, 1,000 square feet, and you have a home that's 2,000 square feet, that home is not. It's an over improvement. So it's a functional obsolescence problem. Therefore, it's not going to bear the same thing or as much based on that much more square footage. It's not going to get the return on the investment.
Okay. Yeah, and I ask that because so many clients come to me and they'll ask, well, what do you think this property's worth? And based on this sale and the price per square foot, they're already coming in with an idea on their price, and it's usually based on price per square foot.
I know. I agree. I've seen a lot of people do that, And what they might do is use a whole city and say, okay, this part of the city might be in a
Yeah.
superior school district, right? And in a golf course community, and then their house is not even close to that. But they're saying, well, I've got this much square footage, and so does this person, but they're in a completely different location.
Yeah.
It's sort of like Silicon Valley has a 1,200 square foot home for $1 million.
Yeah.
And then you have a 1,200 square foot home somewhere here in the East Bay. It's not going to like pan out, right?
Yeah.
Because of the location of the property, or Pebble Beach or something.
Yeah. So as realtors, we're asked to provide an estimate of value, our opinion, to clients all the time. Now, one of the biggest problems we run into is, what if there's not enough comparables within the neighborhood to even determine a solid price? Like sometimes, especially for example, in a condo development, if there's enough sales, you have a pretty good idea of what the 1 and 2 bedrooms are selling for, and you can pretty much be accurate on your estimate. But if there's no sales within the condo development, I mean, I sold a condo several months ago that there was only 1 sale in the entire building in like the last year, but all the other sales were condo developments around it. So how do you, if you have a lack of comparables, how do you appraise a property?
Sometimes you have to expand your parameters, or go back to see what's going on. In some cases, I've noticed in Berkeley and Oakland and other areas where they have small infill condos. So there's going to be, the law of averages is there's not going to be as many sales. So you will have, your other outside sales are going to be relevant to what that's going to come in at, because the housing project is so small in comparison to some of the other bigger built ones. So you try to stick to age, condition, square footage, utility, school district. Again, I don't verify the school district. And in some cases too, like there's unique properties where Victorians have been condominiumized, like flats into 3. And so those can be unique because not everybody has that ability to subdivide those into condos, because I know they have to go through a lot of state and city legislation to do that. But again, you might have to use something more unique to see what that value would be. And it is a challenge. Everything isn't a cookie cutter wrapped up with a little red bow.
Yeah. Is there a difference in evaluating residential homes versus condominiums? Are they pretty much easy to do on both sides?
It all depends. There's been cases where, again, because I've been doing this so long, I've probably seen things that people haven't seen, where a condo was a townhouse. It was legitimately a townhouse, and now the legal has changed in that development because they didn't pay a certain fee to keep the townhouse infrastructure, if you will, right?
Okay.
So in that regard, it's very specific to the form you use. If it's a lender, I do general purpose appraisals. So in that case, the general purpose wouldn't matter so much as far as the form goes through the lending purposes. It's the same technique as far as putting the weight on the sales comparison approach. There's single family 1 to 4s. So if you're going 2 to 4s with income producing properties, that's when you would do rental surveys. And in some cases, you might have the income approach hold more weight over the sales comparison approach. But typically with single family, unless it's rented, you're not going to take the income approach into consideration on that form.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about manufactured homes? Because that can sometimes make or break a deal. I mean, how do you, and that comes down to lender requirements as far as financing, but how do you appraise a manufactured home that's within a neighborhood of your standard homes that are non-manufactured?
Very carefully. I I did appraising of manufactured homes back in the early 90s because I worked for a company that owned an appraisal company called Sunrise Appraisal, Land Home Financial in Contra Costa. And they specialize in that type of lending. And so I did a few then, but you really have to keep up on all these different rules and regulations with them. So it's not one of my niches. There's, as I said, there's different niches.
Mm-hmm.
And I do know that one time I had a request to do an appraisal in Fremont, of all things. And the house was a hybrid. It looked like a normal house in a 1947, mid-century neighborhood. But they'd put like this facade on it. But then when you walked around it, you could see there were certain elements of the size of a manufactured home, the type of venting it had, and who knows if it had an access on it or not. But it was being sold. And I told the realtor at the time that I was uncomfortable proceeding with that until they could give me documentation that explained that this was a stick-built home, because I had my suspicions, because sometimes they can make it so they cover up the plates and everything else so you don't know. And you don't want that to come back to bite you later on down the road, right? So sure enough, I was going to New York at the time and going back and forth, and in the end, it was even zone manufactured on the county records, even though those aren't always indicative of what's there, because it could say that it allows that, but it even had the odd zoning kind of tip off to me that made me wait for an answer, and at that point it got canceled.
Yeah, and that's an important thing, to really identify what the property is. I know in Richmond, in a few neighborhoods, there's been a few people that have bought land and actually built houses out of storage containers. And like, you walk into a place, I mean, if you're looking at the house from the outside or once you walk in, you can't tell. They've done such a great job of it, but at the entrance, sometimes you can kind of tell certain differences, and it makes you wonder. And then you talk to the owner, oh yeah, I built this myself out of storage containers. And they built a home very cheap. It's fully insulated, electrical, it's got plumbing, it's got the whole deal, but it was built with storage containers.
And therein comes your certificate of occupancy through the county, because if things weren't done or permitted to the local zoning code, then they could be fined. And if, let's say, the electrician wasn't qualified, then you have health and safety issues. And then the placement of those storage containers on the lot, if they were allowed variances, which I don't know what the rules are, they could have the wrong setbacks to the property lines, which would then be illegal. So somebody, unless they had cash and the city didn't pull them over and cite them with a violation, then they may be, like I say, out of compliance.
Yeah, they built it in county, and I believe they built it according to code, and they got the permits and everything. But yeah, it was just very interesting to see a home built out of storage containers. And again, you look at it from the outside, you cannot tell until they tell you, oh yeah, here's how I built it and here's how I designed it, and that's how you know.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I wonder how the county would, which is an assessment value, so it's different than
like how they would classify it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
exactly.
That I didn't look into, but now I'm curious. I'll have to look it up. Now, I do property management, and I work with a lot of investors and multi-unit properties. And the question always comes down to, how do I determine the value, or what's the value of my building today, right? Sometimes the owners want to know on a yearly basis the increase or decrease in overall value. So if you have an income-producing property, what's the easiest way to estimate the value?
That's where it can become tricky for variables involved in income producing properties to include the type of renters you have, what your property can rent for, whether it's Section 8, long-term tenancy, rent increase restrictions or not, which all play into the value of the income element versus just if you were to sell it, which then sales comparables would come into place with that. But that's when you'd need to look for a similar utility 1-to-1 bedroom or 2-to-2. The age, a lot of them, they don't always match up because there's fewer income properties within the whole city in some cases. I do those off and on in Oakland, and in some cases you have to be, again, careful of where those properties are located. There's a lot of properties in Oakland that have these beautiful panoramic views, and they were built in the 50s where yours might be built in the 20s. Some of them have been constructed with being grandfathered, predating zoning. And in some cases, I've even seen it where the zoning only allows one dwelling, but because it was built predating zoning, they'll allow those 8 units or 4 units to exist. But if they don't have that permitted by the city and then they were to burn down or something, they may not be able to reconstruct them. And the problem with identifying that problem is I've even gone to the city to try to identify timelines. The city doesn't even have a complete file, so I'm not even going to typically go down that path anymore. I'm going to put it back on the owner or the lender to satisfy as an appraiser, and that's where your extraordinary assumption and hypothetical conditions may come into the report in regard to just those gray matters that come into play.
Now, do you also take into account the area's cap rate for income properties?
Not in the 1-to-4 residential. That would be a commercial appraiser,
okay,
which would be a certified general appraiser who would do the income streams and all these other variables, and that's usually more than 4 units. That's when you get into the commercial level, 5 and up. And then the lending is different, and probably the rates are higher typically.
Okay. Now, on appraisals, you also take into account the reconstruction cost. Is that correct?
We do what we call the cost approach, which involves the land and improvements. And it's not always required by lenders. And typically, the cost approach has more relevancy if a property is brand new, because it's all how much more it would be to construct. And there's different websites, Marshall Swift and Building.net, that can give you variables for the zip codes of where you are to try to develop the cost approach, and whether you have depreciation for pool or externalities to come up with a value. As a lot of insurance companies might refer to that, but typically we go back to the sales comparison approach of what's sold in that neighborhood over the cost approach because of the lack of land sales in built-up neighborhoods, for instance. It's just not as clear on the value.
Okay. Now, over the years that you've been doing appraising, how have you seen the Bay Area values improve? I mean, it seems like values over the long period of time just continue to go up. And of course, there's cycles in between, but I wanted to get your opinion on values. Do values always go up?
In more recent years, the values have been climbing, and in some trending analysis that we do within the report shows, like, the first quarter it's up, second quarter it's down, then it's up again, which could mean that the market is stable, even though in the immediate scope, it might be up. But they have been continually going up with the advent of us being in an area where there's high incomes due to the tech industry that have driven the prices at a very high level, which in turn makes it very hard in some cases to even do a time adjustment for an appraisal because you don't have the data to even do that other than people outbidding other people. So I have seen it in ups and downs throughout the years and then stable markets as well. And you wonder how long it can keep going up before it levels out again.
Do you see a correction coming sometime soon?
I don't have a crystal ball, but if I had to say, I like I say, I don't know how people's salaries can keep being reflective of the prices just going way out there.
Now, recently in the news, there's a property that went on the market, and they are taking and accepting Bitcoin to buy the property. If someone came in with Bitcoin to purchase this property, and they hired you to do an appraisal on the property, would the type of currency affect how you appraise a property, or it's still the same process?
It's still the same process. I would note in the appraisal, for instance, there's a contract section, and there's also a section where it will say how they're financing. It's usually I get the information when it's a sale, and they want to know if there's a gift, if there is credits, if it's an FHA, VA, cash, conventional type situation. So in that case, if it was a sale, I would indicate that on my paperwork that this Bitcoin was part of the transaction or all of the transaction, and that would be then a lending underwriting decision whether it would accept that or how they would incorporate that as cash, or it's sort of like,
or how they convert it to cash.
Exactly, sort of like stocks, right?
Yeah.
Like, do they have to be sold and that type of thing, which is kind of beyond my scope because I'd only have to report what they think is what their lending constraints are on that.
Yeah. Okay. So determining the value of the property, it's still the same process for you, regardless of the currency.
Exactly.
Now, one of the, and I don't know if this is true or is just something that just happens a few times, but it seems as if when someone is getting their property refinanced and they get an appraisal done, that appraisal is usually higher than an appraisal done on a resale of a home. Is that true? Is that not always the case? I mean, that seems to be something that happens a lot, but I'm not sure if that's just something I've noticed in my small sphere, or that's something that legitimately happens.
Okay, what happens with appraisals and the valuation process is it's an art, not a science. And in some cases, the actual estimation provided to the lender or related party user, let's just say I did one and someone else did one. And this happens with a lot of high-end properties with banks, whether it's a sale or a refinance. They'll get two to make sure that those numbers are within a certain percentage. Like if they're, like, let's say over 5%, they may say, well, they might have a reviewer look at it and say, well, reconcile these two reports as to why there's this difference of opinion. And so there's going to be it's not going to be exact, but if it's way different, that's when they're going to need to kind of say, well, what is the deal here? And maybe get a third opinion, because the comps in some cases, especially again in certain areas that are non-track like Oakland Hills, you can have multiple zip codes, even on Rose Avenue. You have 94610 and 11, where it's Piedmont and then Oakland, literally on the same street. And if you blur some of those boundaries, then you can have completely different values coming out of that, even though they're in the same location.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I remember when I was selling foreclosures in 2007 and 8 that many of the banks would do 2-agent broker price opinion. And so they would have me do one of them, and then they would hire another agent to do another BPO, and they would compare the values. And if the values were completely off, that's when they would bring in, off by a certain percentage, then they would bring in an appraiser to see who was more accurate. And then sometimes they would bring in a second appraiser because depending on their policies and behind the scenes of what they require for the investors.
Right, that makes sense. And a lot of companies, because they do not want to keep the loan in their portfolio, they want to sell it because they're going to make money when they sell it. In some cases, they want to make sure that that appraiser did the appropriate measures to make sure they're within the guidelines and there's no sticking point that will hold them back from, selling that paper.
So appraisals on refinances tend to be higher than resale.
I have no comment on, because it to me it's what the fair market value is and how the comps look, whether it's a refinance or not. And in some cases we're in kind of a low inventory market, so in some cases you have only a certain amount of comps to work with that are reasonable. And so hopefully your adjustments and somebody else reviewing what you're doing, that you're all on the same page with it. And like I say, if you're not, that's when you might be getting a rebuttal from the client because they think that their house is the Taj Mahal and it's not. And or they think that it's in superior condition, more customized than this home. And that goes on to say, like, even on the newer homes, when you have a brand new home, there could be somebody putting $200,000 into a brand new home versus $100,000 in upgrades. But unless you have those hardcore figures, you have to rely on interviews with realtors or what the MLS photos kind of display, and then the comments. And then I've also noticed that in some cases when I'm kind of torn as to why there's an outlier in the value, it could be because you go on the internet and you see realtor comments saying, hey, this floor plan was funky, or this had drainage problems, or it appeared to have uneven floors. And then you can then say why you precluded that or why you did include it but why you didn't put weight on it. So it's all this whole kind of identifying markers as to why something is so much higher or lower. A 1031 exchange in some cases could be higher than your comps, not always, but it just depends on your market participant and some of the strings attached to that sale.
Okay, so let's finish off with, you mentioned rebuttals. And I know there's, an appraisal happens on a property. If maybe the person doesn't agree with the end value of the appraisal, they'll want to file a rebuttal, and sometimes they offer their own comps for the appraisal. How often does that happen, and can that really sway your opinion on the final appraisal value?
Yes, it's very rare that it happens because everything I do with certain banks gets touched, so it's kind of like a tag team in a way. But in the event that it happens, they will send me new updated comps that they think are relevant to maybe changing my opinion of the final estimation of value. And I detail out and research the comps. And for instance, if it's in Hayward Hills, which this happened to me once, and all the comps that the person thought were comparable to their property were comps that had panoramic views of the city, and theirs was in like a cul-de-sac without the views of the city. So, and there were some other things in that regard. The appraisal amount stood at the original estimation of value. About 6 months later, I just kind of checked the house, and sure enough, they listed it at what my appraisal was at. And another tip off to that, since we're on the subject, is if you look at the property history, it will show if they've listed it or if it's an expired listing, it's been on the market or not. This particular property that had a rebuttal had been on the market for several days and didn't sell for like 90 days. And some other appraiser appraised it from another bank higher. But I didn't mention about the pre-existing listing that expired. And so there was an oversight there, and they appraised it using comps that I didn't think were as reasonable. So when they came back with a rebuttal, not only could I say it was marketed and didn't sell as high as what the other appraisal was, and the fact that I wasn't going to use comps and make view adjustments when I had comps without view adjustments. And in addition to all of that, it went through.
Maybe the house had filter views. I saw that on a listing where it was a view between, if you looked across the street at the two houses, in between the two houses, you had a view, and that was your filtered view.
Yeah. I had it once where a guy said, I have a view of Mount Diablo, and I got to his house in Clayton, and he walks outside. He goes, look at this view. But there was absolutely no view in his confined interior unit, right? It's like, yeah, I could have that view too every day.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for being on the podcast. This was very informative. If people want to contact you for an appraisal, what's the best way for them to do that?
My email is KELIRENNER and my phone number is 925-595-6052.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you for being on the podcast.
It was awesome. Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Thank you to our producer, Sam Lubin. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share the podcast. Remember, you can listen to the podcast on iTunes, Podbean, iHeartRadio, Google Play, SoundCloud, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. For more information on my business as a property manager and real estate team, go visit my website at markguzman.com. I really want to thank all of you for listening. It means the world to me, and I hope today's episode provides you value in your day-to-day life. I created this podcast to help showcase the many great people that live in this world and help share some knowledge that I've learned along the way in life. Again, thank you for listening. Check out our sponsors, and I'll catch you on the next episode.